Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to a session on can we trust the Gospels as part of the Gospel Online series this year. So, in this session, we're going to do a few very brief things. The first is say hello, introduce who I am and what I'm not. Then we're going to think about setting some context, thinking about what reliability means. Then we're going to think about introducing the Gospels, and then we'll think about this question of are they historically reliable? So I guess to start with, a brief hello. My name is John. I live in the UK. I have never been trained in biblical studies or textual criticism or anything like that. I studied economics and management. So I am not someone who speaks with great authority. And so what you'll see in this presentation is where I'm referring to the work of others, the brilliant work of others. I'll cite it on the slide so you can go and check it for yourself. But other than that, hello, thanks for listening. So before we go into the sort of subject of the reliability of the Gospels specifically, I thought we'd think a little bit about when we use these terms like reliability and trust, what do we actually mean? And I think it's a word we use all the time. We'll talk about a friend, whether they're reliable or not. Oh, yeah, she's pretty reliable. She'll turn up on time, or she'll reply to my message, or something like that. And we use it in all sorts of settings. I work in cars. Big question, are they reliable? Doesn't mean, will they never fail? It just means how often do they fail? Can you broadly trust them? Might talk about it with phone reception. Or I work in London, public transport, pretty big topic there. Or I'd like a builder. Can you rely on them? Pretty obvious word. I think generally we know what it means, but here's some dictionary definitions. And the concept here is the quality of being trustworthy or of performing consistently well. And then it says their second definition is the degree to which the result of a measurement, calculation, or specification can be depended on to be accurate. So that's generally how we use the term, and it's kind of the way I'm using the term tonight. But in the context of reliability and being able to trust someone or something, what do we mean when we're thinking about historical reliability? And there's a number of different ways in which historians do this. And if anyone studied history, you'll be all too well aware of these sorts of things. So when we're thinking about which documents are reliable, we'll think about who they are, why they were writing, were they an eyewitness to the events, or they heard it from someone else? Why were they writing the thing that they were writing? Did they get information about the place that they were writing or the time they were writing? How close to the source were they? Are they biased? And the answer to all of those questions will then give you a kind of idea about whether something, a document or a person is sort of reliable about history. So we're going to think about that a little bit today. Now, before we do, let's briefly introduce the Gospels, because we've thought there a little bit about trust and reliability. We're now going to think about the Gospels, and then we're going to join the two together for the last and the bigger part of our video. So firstly, for some basic points, there are 4 Gospels in the Greek New Testament. They are called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and fairly obvious point, they're different from one another. Let me give you one example. They're different in their length, and lots of other ways, but their length is a good example. I'm a numbers guy. Here's some numbers. These are the amount of words in the Gospels, and it kind of illustrates they're not all the same. So they are different in the way that they present information about Jesus. Key point 1. But lots of the content is shared. So on, I would say, most of the core events about Jesus and his followers, they agree on an awful lot. So I think on the slide, there should be a whole wodge of stuff about Jesus, names he's called, what he does, the individuals he interacts with, the places he goes, the fact that there's a relation with a chap called John, who became known as John the Baptist, and what he came to do, that he was a miracle worker, that he taught some stuff, much of which we probably would still know today, even things like loving your enemies and that sort of thing. It's well known today. All 4 of the Gospels say that. Then they all say he was opposed by the Jewish religious and political rulers. He did stuff that wound them up, like healed people on a Sabbath, which was very important to them. Then he had this sort of entry into Jerusalem. He then has a meal with his followers. He's betrayed, he's arrested, and then he dies. And then all four of them say that he was raised, seen by some women, and there was this stone that was there over the tomb, no longer there. So, yes, they're different, but on the basic arc of Jesus's life and the key reasons, the key things about him, they agree. And that every single one of the four Gospels, every single detail on that page is covered by. Now, this is relevant because some people say stuff that's just not true. Now, there's a chap called Christopher Hitchens, he's no longer alive. He was a very smart man, but he says something here in his book, God is Not Great. It's just patently wrong. He says here, at the end of that quote, they cannot agree on anything of importance, the Gospels, which is just nonsense. So I guess the point we've just started to establish is there's four Gospels. Yes, they are different, but on the bulk of Jesus's life, they are very consistent. They have the same broad narrative. And to the question we talked about maybe, I don't know, a few minutes ago, what bias do they have? Well, of course they're biased. They are wildly pro-Jesus. They are unashamedly Christian documents. They are not remotely neutral. And they tell you that. So there's a verse in Luke, and he's writing to this man called Theophilus, and he's saying, the reason I've written this is so that you can know with certainty what was being taught to you. Now, in the previous video, Jason was talking about this and saying, well, actually, Luke really tried to find out the facts, and definitely did, but he is clearly trying to convict this man of who Jesus was. So he's got a vested interest. John's probably even clearer, and he says that he's written the document so that people will believe that Jesus is the Messiah, a sort of Jewish savior figure and the Son of God. So, and by believing you may have life in his name. So there is no question these documents are biased, much, I would argue, like pretty much any document you read. And then a few other facts just before we get into the meat of the topic. The Gospels, no surprise, they're not like 21st century biographies, even if that was a sort of a genre of thing. And if you've ever read political biographies, they do differ in the way they do them. So it's not like we've got something that's all the same now and it's different then, but they're definitely not what we would see today. So I guess the reason for laying these out is I just think some of that's quite helpful framing. There are these four books. There's not one book. They were written in Greek. We read them in an English translation. They claim to be based on earlier sources even than the written documents themselves. They're largely about a Jew called Jesus and his followers. They describe events in Roman Palestine. So that is a primer on the Gospels in 5 minutes or so as I've rattled through that. So the question really is, fair enough, yeah, got that. But are they actually reliable according to what you might expect for a first century document? And let's just check ourselves here. They're not 21st century documents, so we probably can't hold them to the standard that you'd expect from 21st century biography. So that leads us on to this question of, are the Gospels historically reliable? Okay, so we've thought about reliability. That's this concept of trust. Can you trust something? We thought a bit about historical reliability, and then we briefly introduced these four documents called the saying, well, there's lots of different ways that you can think about the reliability of anything, whether it's, I don't know, document from the Roman period or the Middle Ages, whatever it might be. And there's loads of ways of doing it. Now, I wanted to keep this fairly condensed, so I'm going to pick just one of these four areas. And it's actually probably one of the ones that's the hardest to get right. So we're going to pick the question, well, do these sources, these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do they get the time and place correct? Okay. And is it corroborated by other sources? So that's the question I'm going to focus on. Now, in later videos, we'll cover lots of the other questions on this. But I thought before we sort of go into all of those details, we'd sort of zoom out and go, well, if they can tackle that question, it kind of gives you reason to give them a fighting chance. So let's think about time and place. Now, the general consensus from scholars is that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were all written not in the land of Israel, where the events that they narrate took place. So that's interesting. So these people weren't writing in the land, but they're writing about a different country. So that's harder, I'd argue, than necessarily writing something when you're in that place. I live in Hertfordshire. If I'm writing about Hertfordshire, it's probably easier because I'm kind of there. If I was writing about Hertfordshire and I lived in, I don't know, Bordeaux, it's going to be harder. Okay. Now we're going to think about loads of different things in time and place, or you could think about loads of different things, whether they get architecture right, or culture, or plants, or the names of people, or the weather, whatever it might be. So we could think about all these. I'm going to pick two. The first is personal names. Do they get the names of the people right for the place they were writing? And the second thing is, do they get the geography right? And as we do that, we will, particularly in the second question, think about some of the other gospels that sometimes people say, oh yeah, but what about the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas? Why aren't they in the Bible? We'll use this question just to stress test them as gospels in comparison to the four gospels we have in the New Testament. Okay. So question for you if you're watching. So imagine you've been tasked by a publisher to write a historical novel about Germany, or yeah, let's take Germany for the example, in the 1970s. And the publisher has said, you've got four key characters in their 30s. You need 2 men, 2 women. Without cheating, come up with 4 names and try and make them as historically plausible as possible. So this is a bit weird because it's on YouTube. But what I'd say is pause the video, write down 4 names that you think are the most likely names that would have been present in Germany in the 70s for people in their 30s. Go. Okay, so you're back with me. Now, if you go back and look at the people who'd have been 30 in 1970, guess what? They're born in 1940. And what were the most popular names? Hans, Peter, Klaus, Wolfgang, and Jim. Women, it's Karin, Renati, I think I pronounced, Monica, Ursula, and Ingrid. Okay, now, unless you're brilliant, most people don't get that right. It's quite a hard question to answer because you've not been there. Okay. So that's the sort of frame on this question. And just in case you think you have it hard, most of the people probably watching this have probably been educated to a reasonably good level, school, maybe university, maybe even beyond that. You're probably literate. You've probably traveled to Germany, or maybe some of you have. You might have watched German films or studied German history. And yet that task is actually quite hard. And yet we've got gospels written maybe 30 years after the life of Jesus, 40 years, something like that, doing the same thing, not written in the land and writing about people in the land. So that's quite a hard thing, I would argue, to get right. Let me give you another example that just illustrates that getting historical time and place is quite hard. This painting you've probably seen before is by Leonardo da Vinci, and it's a picture of the Last Supper. And when you first look at it, you think, yeah, okay, that's a historical scene. The clothes look reasonably good. They've got long hair, fair enough. But the closer you look, you realize that a lot of stuff here isn't anything like what it would look like when Jesus actually lived. So like, here's some examples. It's a rectangular table. Everyone's seated at one side. Pretty odd thing to do, and clearly done for the effect of a painting. It's a Renaissance building. Renaissance buildings weren't around in the 1st century. They're eating grilled eels and oranges. You probably had oranges in Israel at the time. You probably didn't have grilled eels. And then also in the background is a picture of Tuscany. Now, I don't know that Da Vinci was ever claiming that this was a historically accurate picture, but it just proves that actually it's quite hard to get the time and culture right. And often we see now in the way we read things of ancient times, often through the prism of things like pictures, often they're not trying to get it right. And even if they are, they get it wrong. So I guess the point of these two examples, the Hans and Ingrid one and this one, is it's quite hard to get historical time and place correct. So it's a good threshold to test the Gospels by. And then to add to that, names are hard to remember, aren't they? This study sort of illustrates this. It's often true. You'll be like, who is that? What? Oh, I'm sure I'm. And the reason is that the name that someone's got doesn't immediately link to their personality. You can have a mate called Bill and another mate called Bill, and they're completely different characters. Bill doesn't really have a meaning per se. So names are hard and time and place is hard. So let's see whether the Gospels get it right. So, firstly, let's review the names of key characters in the Gospels. And on this, I am leaning on two books. I wouldn't say these are particularly bedtime reading, frankly. The Lexicon of Jewish Names in Late Antiquity and Jesus' Eyewitnesses, Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony. But they both have done some painstaking work looking at the most common names in the period when Jesus lived. So, which were the most common male names in the Gospels and Acts? And you'll see them on the list. Simon's the most popular. Then you have Joseph, Judas, John, Jacob, Ananias, Matthew, and then a variety of others. Okay, so Simon and Joseph, most popular names in the Bible, in the Gospels, in the life of Jesus. Then you can go away, and I admire the people who do this. Go and study things like bone boxes, records from the time, to work out what the most common male names there were in Palestine from outside the Bible. Okay, and guess what? Here are the names: Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, John, and so on. Okay, so we've got a source from the Bible, and we've got something that's nothing to do with the Bible. It's just bone boxes, records of people at the time. And what you see is actually there's some quite close similarities between the sort of popularity of names we see in the Gospel and Acts and what we see from something from outside the Bible. Okay. Now, it's worth saying the later Gospels don't do this anything like as well. I think I've got some examples a little bit later. But that's pretty interesting. Yeah. So the Gospels get the names of men pretty correct and the sort of density of the names right as well. So that's quite intriguing. Other way of looking at it is they get similar sort of proportions of names right. So in the sort of outside of the Bible sources, about 16% of men are called Simon or Joseph. In the Gospels, it's 18%. The top 9 male names make up about 40% in both documents. So the sort of distribution of names is very similar, which is sort of what you'd expect if someone's writing about actual history. Okay, and it's interesting because elsewhere in Palestine, people could be like, yeah, but maybe Jews wherever they were in the empire had the same names. So if you're writing it from Egypt or somewhere, you'd have the same names. Not true. So you can see here, these are the top names in Egypt: Sabbatai, Dositheus, Pappus, Ptolemaeus, Joseph, Eliezer, Samuel. So there's a couple that are the same, but lots of them that aren't. So again, it sort of says, actually, you'd really need to know life in Roman Palestine to get that right. Now, that's men. Brief think about women, only because it seems that parents had less imagination about women. But what you'll notice is that, again, similar things happen. Mary's the most popular name, just like you'd expect you see in the outside of the Bible sources, and the name density and distribution is pretty similar. So I guess key point 1 is names are hard to get right, but the names mirror Jewish names in Palestine in the right era, to a sort of impressive level. Impressive, I guess, if you were forging something, but if you're just writing about history and that's the thing you know, it's sort of intuitive you would get that right. So just before we go on to geography to finish, just if you remember back to our German names from the 1940s. So let's say you were back, your publisher writing this book, you managed to dig out the birth records from the 1940s, you've got the right names. There's a problem, isn't there? Like if you've got 6 characters in your story called Hans, the question is, which Hans are you talking about? And what you'd start doing is explaining which Hans it is by clarifying which one. So you'd say, oh, Hans, he's Gunther's son, or he's a butcher, or he's called Hans Klinsmann, or, oh, that's Hans, the lad who broke his leg, or you give him a nickname like Hanny. Okay, so at work, I'm known as JD because there's other Johns, or at school, there's 3 Jonathans, so you all know by your surname. That sort of thing is very common, and you kind of do it intuitively when you've got more than one person with that name. So the question then is, does the Gospel do that? This is often called disambiguation. So it's taking the ambiguity away from something and explaining which person you're talking about. So what you'd expect to see in the Gospels is when you've got really common names like Mary or Simon, they should explain which Mary you're talking about. Otherwise, you're like, well, you've told me about 7 Marys. Which one are you talking about? So this is exactly what you see. Mary Magdalene, or Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, or the other Mary, Sister Mary, and so on and so forth. Okay, exactly what you expect. Loads of people called Mary. Which one are you talking about? They explain that. Here's another one, Simon. Most popular male name. Guess what? Pretty much all the Simons are explained which one they're talking about, whether it's Simon called Peter or a zealot or Barjona. Or you see the point. As in, when you've got loads of people with a popular name, you have to disambiguate about which one they are talking to. So the point, I guess, is in this names question, common names are clarified, whereas others are not. So when we get reference to Thaddeus, which was the 39th most popular name in Roman Palestine, it doesn't need to tell you which Thaddeus, because there's no other Thaddeus is mentioned, and everyone knows who Thaddeus is because it's a rare name. It's like if you got a kid at school called, I don't know, Wenceslas. You don't need to explain who Wenceslas is because you know who he is. I just put myself on mute. Right, so then that was question 1, names. Does it get them right? Clearly, yes. The next question is around the names of key places in the Gospels. So let's have a look at the names of key places mentioned in the Gospels. So this is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So here they are on a screen. And every single place you can see on the screen appears at least 3 times or more. And I think there's about 60 different places mentioned in the Gospels. So that's interesting in themselves because they're clearly rooting the events in physical places. It's not like a narrative where it doesn't really matter where you are. They're anchoring it to places like Jerusalem, big place, Galilee, or something like that. But also smaller places that actually not many people lived in, Bethany or Nazareth or something like that. And it is interesting to call out and say that the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are all very keen to tie things to specific locations, whereas some later Gospels really don't do that. They were written much later. So the 5 later Gospels I've pulled in here are Thomas, Mary, Peter, Philip, and Judas. And you'll say they don't really do a great deal about mentioning place names. They do mention Jerusalem. That was the capital. You could say, easy to get that one right. Judea, also big province, easy to get right. The rest, Garden of Joseph, who knows? Barbello, we've never found historical evidence of that. Paradise, yeah, and the Jordan. Again, a very, very famous destination. And I could probably, like, if I think about Germany, I could probably get the big stuff right. If you asked me to name a provincial town, if I didn't really know German football, I wouldn't have had a clue. So this is just interesting. These 4 Gospels that we've got really anchor events in history, in a place, and in a time. So the question then is, are they details in the narrative that they call out? And the answer is yes. So here's like 4 relatively random examples. I'll just pull that one from each side. Matthew says, oh, he lived in Capernaum by the sea. So it's not just saying there's a place, it's attaching it to another geographical marker that it's a seaside town. You see in Luke 10, Jesus tells a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, for anyone who's ever been to Israel, that road really is down. It's a really aggressive road downhill, or this sheep gate in John, i.e. the Gospels sort of by instinct give you detail about geography. What about later Gospels? This is one. Doesn't make any sense. It's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and you'll see at the end of it, it says, Jesus Christ did something after being born in our region Bethlehem. It's not a region, in the village of Nazareth. So that's not true. Clearly, the writer doesn't know what they're talking about. Okay, so I guess first point in this place thing is they give detail about places. The later Gospels don't. And actually, this data here comes from a lady called Julie Woodson at Tyndale House, and with thanks to Peter Williams from Tyndale House who shared this. What you can see on this chart is how many place names there are by Gospels. So you can see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have over 70, and then the later Gospels have less than 5 each. So in itself, that's interesting. And I think they're almost like a helpful control group. they're writing at least 100, 150 years after the event, much, much less information about place. Now, you might be thinking, but from a stats point of view, maybe they're much shorter and you wouldn't expect that to be true. And actually, on some level, that's kind of true. So the 4 or 5 later Gospels are shorter documents. The 4 sort of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are larger Gospels. So you could say, well, does that sort of distort it? But what you can do is you can take the amount of place names they mention and divide it by a standard number like 1,000 to get a kind of how many place names per 1,000 words, for example. And what you'll notice is that it's very consistent, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, I think that's interesting because then when you look at the later Gospels, they're much, much lower. And I think it's Peter Williams who makes quite a good joke that says, well, you can't imagine that Luke's writing his Gospel and he thinks, golly me, how many place names for 1,000 words did Matthew write? I need to get it pretty close to that. That's not the way that you write biographical works, particularly in the ancient world where they wouldn't have done anything like this level of statistics. It just reads right that they all just anchor the life of Jesus in a time and a place, and they get it right. That's very, very hard to forge. So the second part of what I've tried to say on can you kind of trust the Gospels is they get the place names correct, just like they got the names of people correct. So to summarize, and I've whipped through that, but hopefully it gives an interesting argument about the Gospels. Now, there's loads of stuff we haven't talked about, unashamedly. We haven't talked about other non-Christian historical sources like Tacitus and others. We haven't looked at loads of other things on the historical reliability slide we referenced. They will come in time. We haven't looked at how the Gospels have been transmitted to us. They're originally written in Greek. We've now got them in English. How did that happen? There's some bits of the Gospels that I don't think were original. So bits of the New Testament, if you read a Bible today, a King James Bible, there's bits there I don't think were actually in the original documents written. Doesn't just massively impact anything, frankly, but we haven't talked about it. And we haven't looked for sort of transparency about details where some detail in the Gospel seems to clash with another ancient source. That will come in another session. So I'm not saying for one second that this proves that the Gospels are entirely reliable and there's no questions. But what I have tried to build, the other thing I haven't talked about is contradictions between the Gospels. I'm sure that will come up in another session. But what I have tried to make the claim is, let's think about reliability and let's think about the Gospels and give them a simple test on place and time. And we've thought there's 4 books, not one. That's interesting. So if there's just one, that's a sort of different play. There's 4 things, and they're all making pretty consistent claims about the life of Jesus. They were written in Greek, and they claim to be based on earlier sources. And as I covered in that slide and where I sort of critiquing the argument that Hitchens made, they are largely about this Jew called Jesus and his followers, and they describe events in Roman Palestine. And they all agree on pretty much the main stuff of importance in Jesus's life. And I guess the key point I've been making tonight is they get something right that's actually really hard to get right. And I kind of used the example of Germany in the 1970s and the Da Vinci painting to say, actually, if we have to try and think about stuff and get history right and the names and the places right, it's pretty hard. And yet they get the names of people right to a sort of really impressive level, which probably implies they knew what they were talking about. And they get, when you've got really common names, they clarify which person you're talking about. Again, that's not something I think you'd necessarily do unless you'd lived there or you'd had eyewitness accounts that you could rely on. And then we thought about places and how they often root these narratives in real places, and they give context like, oh, Capernaum by the sea, or that sort of detail. And so I think they then are helpful in revealing Jesus. Now, I believe as a follower of Jesus that he is the foundation of my faith. And I have loads of reasons to think that, particularly the resurrection of Jesus. But I guess what I've tried to do for the last sort of half an hour is just give you a couple of reasons why actually, so that question of can I sort of trust the Gospels? Can I use them as a source to tell me something about Jesus? One argument is, well, yeah, have a look at the time and place. They do get that pretty bob on. So maybe if you're someone who's thinking, oh, I don't know if I can trust all this, it might just challenge that notion a little and open something like a Gospel of Mark, start reading and be confident. They're certainly telling you something that historically happened. And then you've got to wrestle with, well, who was this Jesus? And is it someone I can place my trust in? Hope that makes sense. And any questions, add them into the comments and I'll try and come back to it over the coming weeks. Otherwise, thanks a lot.